Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar includes simultaneous interpretation. To use the interpretation feature, please click on the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, click interpretation, and then click English or French. Bon matin et merci à tous de nous joindre aujourd'hui. Nous assurons l'interprétation simultanée de ce webinaire. Pour utiliser la fonction d'interprétation, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas de votre écran, cliquez sur Interprétation, puis sur Anglais ou Français. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating on this webinar from just outside Ottawa, located on the traditional, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, CAPI recognizes our responsibility to help advance reconciliation and a stronger, more respectful relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. CAPI's work is made possible through the support of partners. You can find out more about how you and your organization can support CAPI on our website, or please reach out to Bree Jones, our Director of Business Development, or me. We look forward to talking to you about how we can work together to advance policy solutions. Sustainability and its place in the agriculture policy landscape has been an increasingly important domestic issue in Canada. But its sustainability is a global issue that requires global action. But that action needs to be tailored to local contexts. How those actions interact with trade is increasingly under the microscope, given trade's role in global food security, and at home, trade's role in the success of Canadian agriculture. The policy dialogue or debate on the intersection on sustainability, trade, and ag policy is at an increasingly critical juncture. The intersection can, at times, seem like a collision with different policy approaches around the world impacting farmers and food systems. So today we want to look at that intersection to understand what is happening on the policy front in Europe, what challenges and opportunities that creates for Canada, and what lessons we can learn from the European experience. We have three great guests. Sorry, I hear someone is just not getting audio. If someone else can confirm that they are, that would be great. We have three great guests that will come along for the discussion today. Sofia Manzanero, Christina Cowell, and Claire Citeau. During the webinar, please use the Q&A function to ask those questions, and we look forward to diving into them later. I'd like to get right into it now with our first guest, Sofia Sanchez Manzanero. Sofia is currently the Brussels correspondent for S&P Global, focused on covering agriculture and the environment. She will soon start with Euractiv, a leading source for news on agriculture and food policy in Brussels. She is a former producer of Good Morning Europe and a digital journalist for Euronews English and Spanish. Sofia also spent some time in Canada during her journalism studies. Sofia, it's great to have you with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Tyler.
Sofia, you cover European agriculture sustainability and trade policies, a busy portfolio at a time when the policy environment is becoming increasingly political. We've all read the headlines, but you've seen those European farmer protests up close in Brussels. I want to start by asking you just to walk us through what's driving those protests, what's brought farmers to the streets, and how those motivating factors are different across the EU.
So yeah, it may seem difficult to understand from the outside because the protest mainly started in Germany in January. There were some protests in Poland in December too. Farmer protests in Europe in general are cyclical. It's true that they are gaining momentum right now and that pretty much every EU member state has joined the protests, but they're not homogeneous. They respond to different national grievances. At least the main trigger is normally national, but of course, farming in Europe is ruled by the Common Agricultural Policy, which is decided at the European Union level. So there are some underlying issues that are shared by farmers across Europe. This is mostly related to income struggles, the financial situation of small farmers, mostly their impact of climate change that is affecting lots of EU member states, mainly in countries like mine in Southern Europe, in Spain, but also implementing new regulation. Farmers are aging, and there's not a lot of generational renewal as well because it's not an attractive profession for young farmers. And then as we will discuss, the threat of trade, which in Europe is perceived in a very particular way among farmers. They feel threatened by new trade agreements with other major agricultural producers. In this case, we are now again negotiating, as we were over the past 25 years, the Mercosur agreement between the EU and Mercosur, so Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And farmers fear that they will imports of meat mostly will flood the markets, and that they don't are not subject to these strict requirements that we are in Europe socially and environmentally. So yeah, different national grievances but shared underlying issues.
And so I think that when we look at when we read the headlines, often what we hear, and I think that this was particularly true in the Netherlands, was that this is a backlash to sustainability policies in Europe, that domestic framework. But again, I gather that there's a difference between, again, the reaction to nitrogen policies in the Netherlands and what's driving the protests in France or in Poland, where there are more unique national dimensions that are playing out.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, at the end, the European Union is a continent with 27 member states and different agricultures. Even in big countries like Spain, agriculture models are very different from region to region. So it's really difficult to, yeah, the nitrogen policy might be harder on the Netherlands. Of course, the Netherlands had their own problems with nitrogen emissions, and that's why the government had to take certain measures. But there is this big push from the European Union and the European Commission to transition to a more sustainable food system. And there has been a flagship strategy called the Farm to Fork strategy, which was in the framework of the European Green Deal. So this big plan to make the EU climate neutral by 2050, the first climate neutral continent. So then again, the worries of adopting new legislation, environmental sustainable legislation, have contributed to this pushback from the farming sector. I follow this legislation, and most of it has not been implemented, and a large part of these initial plans have been even abandoned now at the end of the mandate, because well, we are at the end of the European Commission mandate at European Parliament. We have elections soon in June. So yeah, some of these very ambitious plans have been slowly abandoned because of the pushback, actually.
And in advance of those elections, we've seen a number of political leaders in Europe try to take the pressure down. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a strategic dialogue with farmers to try and hear some of their concerns. What's your expectation for what that strategic dialogue will produce at the end of the day?
Well, I guess many people said that this dialogue should have started earlier, that the dialogue should have probably started when the sustainability plans were being drafted and not now. It is true that I have to say, as a reporter in Brussels, you can see that farming organizations are very influential in the Brussels bubble. They are not insignificant, that they are heard, and they participate in pretty much a lot of minister reunions. It can be surprising. It doesn't happen with other policy areas, but these normally represent these are lobbies that represent large farming, more industrial farming model, and probably they don't always look out for the interest of smaller farmers, which are the majority here in Europe. So I think it was important to have a dialogue with farmers and stakeholders in general from the food chain. That's what the strategic dialogue is about, because there are also other stakeholders like consumer associations or NGOs. It was really important. It was really important to feel that farmers are heard, and I guess not only the lobbies that represent them in Brussels, which is a bit controversial sometimes. I don't know what's gonna come out of it. I think it's quite politically motivated because of the moment this has been launched, just a few months before the elections, and it has been launched also by the president of the European Commission herself, who doesn't get involved usually in agri policy. So yeah, it really shows how much of like political capital is at stake with the farmer issues at the moment and protest.
And just you talked about that engagement, how farmers are active. But how much do you think that the challenge or the what's led to this is that the relationships that the agriculture community has in Brussels tends to be with DG Agri, but increasingly we see other directorates and other political leaders driving agriculture policy that used to be driven out of the Agriculture Commission.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a very particular commission, I guess, in that sense. The European Commissioner for Agriculture didn't have as much power as other commissioners when deciding on when leading the new legislation, the new regulations that were going to be implemented in the framework of the farm to fork strategy. So these were given to the commissioners for, well, the vice president for the Green Deal, for environment, and for food safety. With some shared competences, even in the European Parliament, there were tensions between the Environment Committee and the Agricultural Committee, which again tends to be more conservative when it comes to sustainability and environmental protection. So yeah, definitely. I guess this relationship that normally the farming lobbies have had, or the farming sector with DG Agri, with the Director General for Agriculture, were close in this mandate, but they didn't have take the lead in most of the big legislations. So yeah, it has been very tense, and you could see very often here the Commissioner of Agriculture contradicting some position expressed by the Commission officially. So it's also a commissioner that comes from a far right party in Poland. We have to say that, and that they can be sometimes a bit Eurosceptic. But yeah, there were definitely tensions. For example, when they presented the pesticide reduction rules that have been abandoned. But when these were presented, the agriculture commissioner was not even in the press conference, I believe, which says a lot symbolically.
Great, great. Thank you, Sophia, for helping to set the stage. So I'd like to go to our next panelist, Christina Call. Christina, you are she's the general manager of Trade Up, a consultancy that advises companies, organizations, and governments on how to take advantage of global opportunities, improve trade conditions, and overcome barriers to trade. Christina has extensive experience in the EU governance, including time working with former European Agriculture Commissioner Franz Fischler. Over the years, she's worked on WTO and trade issues, political crisis management, and the implications of Brexit. And Christina, you've gotten to know Cappy for work that you've been doing and your team's been doing on a report on sustainability and policy, but we've struggled because it seems like there's an ongoing need over the last 12 months to try and update the report and keep pace with changes. And so I wanted to start with you around what is the policy and regulatory landscape today in Europe, and what's the difference between the stated policy or the high level of objectives and how these policies are actually being applied today?
Yeah, thanks for having me today hello from a stormy Brussels. I think first we need to start with that we have European agriculture is a very diverse animal, both geographically. I mean, agriculture in Spain is very different from agriculture in Sweden, but also structure-wise on how small, big farmers are, also in age structure, attitudes. Are they exporting? Are they more into a self-sufficient type of country? So the diversity is enormous. And sustainability as such is, of course, very locally driven. I mean, you can't kind of have the same type of sustainability. You can't impose that really on a local level. So the diversity is enormous. And the Commission has taken account of that by, in the last reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, on the one hand, imposing a direction towards sustainability, but on the other hand, giving member states much more flexibility on national plans how to implement that sustainability. And we actually are only starting with this process. So we're really in the first year of implementation there. And one has to say the results are not very convincing. First of all, a lot of member states have been extremely hesitant to really come up with new innovative approaches on pushing sustainability forwards. So most of them have opted for continuing the way they did in the past and just giving it a bit of a greenwash and, but there are also some which kind of have decided to go for something more courageous. For example, the Dutch is a very interesting plan. But then even the countries who put forward kind of interesting measures, farmers didn't take them up. So we have certain measures. I mean, I think the German situation was quite interesting because the Germans had to submit their proposal for a national plan 3 times to the Commission. And the Commission was actually quite hesitant in pushing too much on member states in general, but on this one they did. So, and it was each time because they thought that the agro-environmental measures are not strong enough. So when finally the Germans got their plan adopted by the Commission, then they had a couple of programs where they almost had 0 applications from farmers, where farmers were just not interested in taking these type of measures up. So it just shows that there is a lot of, it's very complex between farming communities, national governments, and the Commission. So we have kind of almost a triangle relationship there. Then, of course, but the direction is very clear. Farmers need to kind of deliver more against their emission reduction targets. And if you look into all the calculations on how to reduce emissions, there is the clear understanding from all experts, agriculture is not doing enough, that the emissions from agriculture are stagnating, but they're not going down. So if the EU wants to meet their targets, they have to do something more radical on agriculture. So for the moment, I think we need to be clear that the last CAP reform has only been operational for 1 year. So because it was delayed by 1 year, and now we're in the first year of implementation, and it will stay until 27. So there is no way anything will happen until then. So it is all about what is the next step. How much more radical do you need to reform the CAP? There's a lot of discussion emerging from that. And I think there we have to see what will the Commission propose, how far will member states be ready to go, and who will finance the whole change of policy direction. I mean, the Green Deal is a very interesting undertaking. And I think it shows a bit the dilemma of European policymaking. Because I think people outside of Europe perceive the EU like a bloc, almost like a government. But the nature of the EU is still quite different from a nation state. So people think that the Commission is a bit like a government, and a government has a parliament, and you have the majority in the parliament, hopefully. So if the government comes up with a plan, you have some discussions in parliament about it, but it's minor adjustments, and it goes through because you have the political majority. And that's totally different at the EU level. The Commission makes proposals, aims always for the ambitious, and then follows a huge discussion, both with member states and with the European Parliament, about do we really want that? How far do we go along with the Commission plans? And the Commission has no majorities at all. It kind of relies on building a majority based on a particular proposal. And that's, of course, a much more difficult exercise than normally in a country for its government. So I think on the Green Deal, it clearly showed that if you talk on sustainability on a broad level, kind of what are our emission targets, everyone kind of is on the same page. Even if you talk about broad strategies, everyone can agree. But once you talk about concrete policy implementation proposals, the gap is huge. And I think that's where the Green Deal is suffering from, by running into big problems on the concrete implementation.
And I think, Christina, that certainly sounds a lot like the Canadian ag sustainability debate as well. But I'm just curious, one of the areas where the Commission has more direct control is on the borders and is on EU trade policy. How much do you see those sustainability pressures creeping into to border measures? So we know border carbon adjustment may be less of an issue for agriculture, but clearly the EU is a leader there. We hear a lot of talk about mirror clauses. How much of an impact will EU sustainability policy have at the border into Europe?
I think when we talk about agriculture and food, then I think for the moment it doesn't have much. Because what really impacts on imports is the question of tariffs, of standards, of controls, right? So there's not much on the sustainability front there yet. I think was a focus on yet. I think we had. I think one also has to say the Commission doesn't have a strategy on agri-food sustainability and trade. It doesn't have that. They know that kind of will follow. But I think they're very focused for the moment on internally getting the sustainability policy really rolling and moving. But we had some very few cases where I think we had this issue of external effects on EU sustainability measures. And that was in particular on some very old toxic pesticides, where the EU imposed and said, we don't use them, we forbid them, and therefore nothing which has been treated with these pesticides from a third country can actually enter the EU. But as far as I know, there haven't been huge concerns from third countries about that, because most of the countries like Canada or the US are not using those pesticides either. So it's more, some of them are still used in some developing countries, where it's an issue, but it's not a kind of, it has not been a huge trade issue. But we have, of course, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which has just started to be implemented 1st of January. In principle, it doesn't include agriculture, but it includes chemicals, so it includes fertilizers, and so there is some link, and we really need to see how that works. But I think we have to be aware that I think in the long run, CBAM will be extended to agriculture. I just can't see that in the long term, it will be kept out. So therefore, I think it's also for agriculture very interesting to see how the CBAM in the other sectors works. And I think everyone in the EU realizes that carbon leakage, as we call it, is an issue. Farmers say, if we need to kind of make our environmental standards more stringent, then agriculture production will move to third countries. So of course we need to make sure that's in no one's interest, also not in climate change interest globally, that happens. So we need to see how we work around that. And I think what is very interesting is that Denmark is for the moment discussing a carbon tax on agriculture. And it's the first EU country which does that in a very serious manner. They have, I think a couple of days ago, an expert group which had been nominated has come up with a report suggesting 3 different models that should be looked into in more detail. And they're now going to have a broad consultation on stakeholders, from farmers to consumers to NGOs, to kind of really broad societal consultation to see how to go about that. And that includes also a huge discussion on who should pay for such a carbon tax. Is it the farmer? Is it the consumer? Is it the public finance? Or is it all 3 of them, in what type of percentages? And I think once the Danes have settled on something in that area, it will have a huge spillover effect on the EU. So I'm quite convinced if the Danes go forward with that, we will have that same discussion at the EU level.
Right.
But when it comes to Canada, or no, fine, let's stop
Yeah,
there.
no, I appreciate it, and I'll just say that it sounds like that discussion on the carbon tax, Christina, is more thoughtful than what we had in Canada before we ended up with one. But I'm going to change gears and bring in our final panelist this morning, Claire Cito. So Claire is the founding president of Trade Bridges, a trade policy and international relations advisory consultancy. She is working with CAPI on a number of different projects and is executive director of the European Union's Chamber of Commerce in Canada. She's also the former executive director of the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, where she worked on numerous bilateral and multilateral free trade agreements, including CETA, CPTPP, CUSMA, UK CTA, and the WTO agreements. Claire is a lecturer and senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, a senior fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and an advisor to the Canada-EU Trade and Investment Association, and former vice president of the Alliance Française. Claire, I wanted to talk to you about the report that you co-authored that was recently released by Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation members. CAPI is a GIFBI partner, a founding member, alongside our counterparts in the US, in Brussels, and in Australia. And we hosted an event in Paris alongside the WTO Committee on Agriculture meetings, looking at these broader global issues related to ag and sustainability and trade. So can you start by sharing your highlights from the workshop and the report, please?
Sure, happy to. And first off, thank you for having me as part of this discussion. And I'm going to read through my notes to share the main highlights of the report. So as you pointed out, last October, I was privileged to attend as a rapporteur the Global Forum for Farm Policy and Innovation dialogue at the OECD, which brought over 80 agriculture trade policy experts and representatives from around the globe to discuss the topic of sustainable agriculture and trade policy. The report was released, and the summary the report is really a summary of the discussions as they relate to the particular intersection of trade policy and agriculture sustainability. There were other things that were discussed that were not captured in this for when they did not touch on that particular intersection. And I think the context is important, and is the growing prevalence of sustainability measures globally. So the discussions dwelled into challenges posed by sustainability measures to agriculture trade and their unintended consequences, which have an impact on productivity, sustainability, and the environment. The discussions also highlighted, I think, what I call the opportunity to pave the way forward and for resilient and equitable food systems worldwide by ultimately better aligning sustainable agriculture and ambitions and trade policies. Two questions were asked to the participants. What is the ideal state of trade and how to get there? And I think if there is one thing to take away from the report and the workshop, it is outcome-based approaches. The forum, and you see the highlights in the report, highlighted 4 key areas for exploration. The first one is on enhancing food systems and trade through outcome-based approaches to sustainability. And the point here is that sustainability and agriculture cannot be approached with a one-size-fits-all mindset. Trade policies must recognize that food systems require local practices adapted to local environments. Every region has unique production practices, scales, soils, cultures, landscape, environmental conditions, and so forth. So the unilateral adoption of environmental policies in one country can have an impact on the global competitiveness of farmers in other countries. And as such, trade policies should differentiate between sustainability outcomes and sustainability practices. Overall, participants all agreed on the need to ensure that trade is based on a shared vision of sustainable food systems, and that global sustainability targets that were set by the UNs as part of the SDGs are adapted to local context. And what was interesting in the discussions is that participants agreed that to level the playing field and avoid barriers, they envisioned a global agreement, a global framework for sustainable agriculture that would include a shared vision, also common objectives, principles with regional attribution, and clear, simple standards, metrics based on science to measure progress on the way forward. The second main takeaway is on the need to identify global cooperation in support of coherent policies and a global framework for sustainable agriculture. Essentially here, the proliferation of standards around the globe is creating a spaghetti bowl of competing, contradictory rules around the globe. And this has a direct impact on businesses, essentially added cost, compliance cost, traceability requirements, red tape, and so forth. The concern is that heterogeneous policies fragment trades in ways that can undermine sustainability and ultimately fail to deliver on the stability and predictability that businesses need and expect from the rules-based trading system. Instead, there is a view that sustainability and trade can and should be mutually supportive rather than work at cross purposes. Part of the challenge is that silos and a lack of coordination, a bit of a disconnect between those working in agriculture, trade, environment, and health makes things a bit more difficult. And to help solve that dilemma, international organizations such as the WTO, the OECD, the FAO, among others, are viewed as important in addressing shortcomings and developing a new global framework that delivers coherent and mutually supportive trade and climate rules. So this is why intensified global cooperation is seen as needed to really encourage the harmonization of trade rules and help ensure that efforts to improve sustainability don't create barriers and costs for businesses, particularly SMEs. I'll touch briefly on the third key takeaway, and I'll be very quick on the fourth one. The third key takeaway is on the need to optimize trade to make agriculture sustainable and profitable. Fundamentally here, and it was really clear during the workshop, there is a need to accept that the agri-food system can deliver profitability for farmers and food manufacturers meaningfully. Agriculture sustainability must be economically viable and a shared responsibility at all levels of the supply chain. Not only that, it must also strike a balance between environmental and economic factors. Essentially here, we expect the system to simultaneously give us food security, nutrition, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability. This is what we call the triple challenge. Domestic subsidies did come up in the context of trade distortions, as research shows that farm support programs, the majority of farm support programs tend to distort trade and be harmful to nature. And there is an opportunity here to repurpose support to improve sustainability. Ultimately, there was one point also shared about the need for transparency and the role of consumers. If sustainability is indeed a new standard globally, we need to consider how we are communicating to the consumers to ensure that it creates values in a way that they will want to pay for it. And to that end, data, trust, transparency and metrics are tools that can help. And the fourth and last main takeaway very quickly is on the opportunity to harness data and technology to transform the way we grow and trade food. And here the enthusiasm for technology advances in agri-food lies in part in the ability to capture, analyze, and exchange data at all levels of the supply chain, to use data and science to make informed decisions, to improve operations at the farm level, and to create transparency, trust, and accountability across the entire value chain. So, yeah.
Yeah, Claire, I just want to pick up before we bring Sophia and Christina back, the comment about a global agreement. I think there is at time this view that a global agreement, a global framework on sustainability could be a challenge for Canadian agriculture. But the reality is it's been global agreements and global frameworks that have enabled Canadian agriculture to have success on the world stage, whether it's the WTO itself, standards set through Codex, and others. You know, how do we think about this as a trade enabling solution for Canadian agriculture exporters in the sustainability context?
I think on the trade and sustainability dimension, I think we need to look at the evidence, and many comments in the report highlight that. We need more data and evidence and dialogues to, I think, better evaluate the intersection of trade and sustainability and the path forward, whether this takes the form of rules, language in trade agreements, global principles and standards established, as you said, by international standard setting agencies. Yes, there was a really strong recognition for the need for outcome-based approaches in the report. I think we need to look carefully at the interplay between the formulation of standards and provisions in FTA, and consider all approaches, practice-based approaches, outcome-based approaches, a mix. I think we are at the beginning of a discussion. I think, you know, the tension is an opportunity to get people together to find solutions and better understand perspectives based on evidence. We need to really recognize that countries can and will continue to adopt sustainability measures individually, and ultimately realizing the full potential of trade and trade policy will require country to work closer together. So we'll say that the path forward does not lie in a rejection of trade, quite the opposite. It lies in part in a better utilization of the system and better integration of sustainability issues in the trade sphere.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And so I want to bring Sophia and Christina back in now and pick up a bit on that question around evidence and analysis. And so, Sophia, I'd like to start with you with one of the questions that we've come in around effectively what's the cost benefit analysis that's been done on the changes the EU would like to make. The European Union may not think much about what the impact is on Canadian farmers, but I'd be curious around how much evidence and understanding there is in Europe around the impact of farm to fork measures and Green New Deal measures on European farmers themselves, and whether or not farmers are pushing back on what that cost benefit analysis says.
Well, so when the Farm to Fork strategy was launched, there was actually an assessment made by the Joint Research Center, that is like the research branch of the European Commission, which was quite controversial among farmers because, of course, they said if we have one of the targets of the Farm to Fork, is to have 25% of farmland under organic agriculture in the EU by 2030. So they said, of course, more organic agriculture means lower yields, which can lead to food price hikes, etc. Lower production in general if we reduce fertilizer use, pesticide use. This was the analysis of the JRC, which is has scientists that work in the commission but are independent. So there was a lot of pushback, and it was used for a bit of scaremongering, I guess, among farmers and population in general. Again, other scientists have come out and said, no, actually, the ecosystem benefits are not being considered. It's not being considered that soil fertility and soil health is at a very poor state in Europe, as another um, study has shown. So we are gonna face lower yields anyway and low production. So there is a bit of scientific debate and tension. The thing is, the EU is very diverse and big, and we don't have a lot of data about farming. Sometimes we just changed recently farm data mm, legislation to be able to collect more data, also on pesticide use, for example, which is very important because right now these kind of impact assessments are mostly based on sales of pesticides. So yeah, we need more data. This has been a big criticism, the impact assessments of the Commission, which sometimes admit that they don't have enough data to be extremely precise. With the pesticide reduction rules, there was a lot of pushback from member states. They actually asked for a second assessment, which the assessment found that food security will not be compromised in the EU. But still, again, the data is an issue, and there are assessments, but they're not as good as they could be.
And Christina, how do you see that challenge playing out where there are these broad dynamics, and it can be hard to understand the relationship of all of these different policies. And I think when you first look at the farm to fork, you realize how many different policies and approaches they are, and trying to understand how it all works together is an interesting dynamic. How do you see that playing out in Europe?
You mean for the future, or?
For the food, yeah, looking forward.
I mean, for the moment, we're in a phase of what I would call hyperpolitization, which has different factors. It's on the one hand, of course, an effect or an impact of the Ukraine-Russian war, which of course had effects in Europe on the cost of fertilizers, costs of energy, inflation, energy prices in general for the general public, but also, of course, for the farmers. Then we have the Israel-Hamas conflict, where people are also kind of very worried about. So we have, and then we have on top of that, the EU elections coming up in June, and with everyone extremely worried about the far right kind of gaining much more votes, because of course the EU elections have traditionally are a bit of a protest election, because you're not electing your local representative, even not your national one, but someone in far away Brussels. So therefore it's much more of a protest election than anything else. So there is a dynamic of this hyperpolitization, which, I mean, the farmers have been using as well. I mean, of course they have grievances, but they also jumped on that. Plus that the Conservative Party has decided in Europe that they are going to use agriculture as their flagship topic for the elections in order to buffer away the right. So we have all that dynamic. And that's where I think it's a bit, I wouldn't really say that the Green Deal was a failure, or that most of the measures of the Green Deals have not been kind of implemented into concrete policy proposals. If you do something as disruptive as the Green Deal, you can't expect that everything goes through in one go. I think we need to be clear that this is a process, and this was the first step. And now we have these elections, and then we're going to have a new commission, and then we will reevaluate how far they came with the Green Deal. They have a lot of expert committees who will tell them that they actually have to go further on a lot of measures than they actually intended. And then they will have to review and come up with a second type of package. And I would just hope that, I mean, some of the problems are intrinsic in the European construction. and with a more far-right European Parliament, things are not going to become easier on sustainability, clearly. But I would hope that the next Commission has kind of learned the lesson that they need to kind of, from a process point of view, that they need to go about this differently. And that's why I would think this strategic dialogue on agriculture, which in itself is not going to deliver much, I'm convinced, but at least it brings that dialogue and kind of consensus building underway. And I think that's going to be important to maneuver for the next Commission to maneuver better through the decision-making process.
And Sophia, I want to come back to you with again, one of the differences I think that we've seen is, again, we hear these measures, these targets around reducing pesticide use that's caused some concern, but in the same time, we see the Commission renewing glyphosate for 10 years. We do see some progress around modernizing the gene editing regulations, although that is slowly working its way through that process. Christina talks about kind of the next phase of this and the evolution that will go on. How do you see, again, kind of that political rhetoric around we need ambitious environmental outcomes and approaches that do recognize that we need science-based decisions as well, that we can implement mirror policies, but that can have a trade distorting impact. How do you see that being reconciled between the political decisions and the pragmatic realities, and what role will more right-wing governments potentially play?
Well, it is a difficult dynamic, and I think, as Christina said, it's highly politicized right now. The moves that the commissioner is making, trying to U-turn on previously announced environmental measures like the pesticide reduction, they are political. They know, and science has said that this is necessary in part. Of course, the target and how much and the percentage, that's up for discussion, but in general, pesticide reduction is necessary, and science has backed this at some extent. But again, it just shows again the whole glyphosate versus pesticide reduction ambitions, how complicated the European Union is. The glyphosate was evaluated by the EU's Food Safety Agency that found there were no critical concerns, and it's really difficult for the Commission to, I will say pretty much impossible, to block an extension of the substance if there are no critical concerns found. They also said they lacked data, actually, in the analysis, but it's just a very complex beast. The discourse now is very pro farming. It seems like every political leader in Europe is really trying to appease farmers as much as they can, and sometimes they make populist decisions which are not going to benefit farmers in the long term. So I wonder, really how that's going to play out. I think, like Christina, they need to pick up the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork where they left it, the new European Commission, but how are they going to do it, or with which phase, after backtracking on so many things publicly, and even some member states, that are not necessarily Eurosceptic at all, and that have supported these objectives before, saying no, we need to defend farmers from this, we need to defend farmers from imports from. It's really complicated, and again, far right in the parliament is going to make things increasingly difficult for the Commission and just to legislate in general. Let's see how it plays out. I will guess that if the Conservative Party gets the leadership and gets a European Commission president elected again, they will soften their stance once they're in power. But now they are really trying to steal votes from the far right. So, difficult situation.
Again, I think it's a good example of there's how policies maybe should be made in a theoretical kind of perfect world context, and then there's the reality of how policies are made, taking into account these political consequences. Christina first, and then I'll go to Claire. But I think we've talked about the difference in member states and the different approaches that are there. And Christina, I'm curious your thoughts around. There are European agriculture, European countries that are major ag exporters. Denmark is a good example. We talked about the Netherlands earlier. Is part of what Canada should be doing working more closely with those member states where we see more of that common recognition? Again, I think much of Eastern Europe farms in similar conditions and ways that Canadian farmers do. What are your thoughts around that? The difference between working at member states versus at the commission level and how that plays out?
Actually, thanks for that question, because that allowed me to bring in, I think, two aspects on that. I think on trade issues, the EU has been always very, skeptical of allowing member states to work with third countries, because that was sometimes perceived, and actually I think it was also really in reality the case, of undermining EU positions in EU policies, right? So we had that quite a bit with, just take Denmark or the UK trying to collaborate with the US. But in this one, we're talking about something different, because I think we need to be much clearer about the joint interests we're having. And I think you were right in saying Canada might have very similar circumstances, protection patterns, whatever, you take as a criteria where you say we're in a similar position with some member states. And each of the member states has its own distinct policy dialogue on sustainability. The Danish discussion on sustainability is very, very different from the Austrian one on sustainable and agriculture. So I think, yes, you should actually look into the different national dialogues and see, is there one where Canada could link itself in? But the other aspect is, I think, if we take the EU and Canada as kind of as the entities, I think also there's much more joint interest on sustainable agriculture than I think both sides are aware. So I think we should really move more towards a dialogue on sustainable policy making for agriculture, and how do we really formulate those policies, and how can we move in parallel. We will never do exactly the same thing, because we're not the same. We're in different situations, etc. But how can we try to move as much in parallel as we can? Because I'm convinced then the whole discussions on trade distortion kind of becomes much more manageable. Because if the way you take, the Canada takes on sustainable agriculture policy making, and the EU one is kind of aligned on certain things, then it makes it easier for overcoming any trade implications. And I think you are in a, and I'm not sure you were aware of that really, to that extent, you are in a very favorable position vis-a-vis the EU, because when we talk about bilateral international trade agreement, the two flagship agreements the EU has is New Zealand and Canada. So CETA is kind of promoted and portrayed and used in the EU as the one, really good trade agreement, which really delivers on both sides, which allows dialogue, etc. And I think the fact that we have a specific dialogue on sustainable agriculture within the CETA agreement, which already has worked for some time and has kind of finished its first round of workshops, I think provides for both sides a really good opportunity, quite unique opportunity, in discussing sustainability and agriculture policy and trade. And I would think the first round of this dialogue was very much focused on exchange of best practice on sustainable agriculture, different production sectors, etc., which is all fair and good enough. But I think now would be the time to say, let's move it a level further. Let's talk about policy making on sustainable agriculture. And coming back to something Claire said before, is kind of how do we set in the future the international trade framework with respect to sustainable agriculture. And of course, and you have the discussion, will it be done on a multinational level? Are we talking, do we ask FAO or WTO or one of those bodies to come up with a framework? We all know that the WTO is not working that well. Is it really realistic to get somewhere there? Or do we actually go to a a bilateral, expanding that to some other countries type of approach, at least to get started with, and then kind of move it forward in the future. So I think there, the EU-Canada dialogue would be a real good point of departure. And if that delivers something, it could then be perhaps extended to other countries which are interested to join into the dialogue.
Right. Thank you, Christina. And Claire, I'm actually going to go to you with a kind of the last question around for everyone, which is really what is one key lesson that Canadian policy actors, again, the people that are on this webinar and others should take away from this recent experience that we see in the EU? What are your thoughts on one lesson that Canada could learn?
I think perhaps let me comment briefly on what Christina said, and it's interesting to hear and positive to hear that the EU CETA is a flagship agreement, and I think there is hope on both sides that it will soon be ratified by all member states, and perhaps building on this and the idea of dialogues between the EU and Canada, certainly. There is a basis for it. There's CETA discussions going on an ongoing basis, bilateral mechanisms. Both parties are member of the Ottawa Group, and they have launched sustainability dialogues and webinar information. So perhaps there's something to do there. I would say if there's one thing to take away from one lesson to take away from what's going on in Europe, but also I think overall in other jurisdictions as well, when we see the sort of backlash in a way about trade and what's going on. First, we need to recognize that this is not going to go away. The sustainability measures will continue because of the importance people place all around the world on their food, how its safety, how it's produced. So which results in a greater number of complex regulatory requirements. It is not going to go away. And I would encourage you, those interested, to read the Fast and Furious. It's not a book about race cars. It's the OECD report that speaks about the rise of environmental impact reporting in food systems and the powerful long-term drivers behind this, which signal that this is not going to change. The one thing to do is to maintain dialogue based on evidence. I can't speak enough about the importance of public-private sectoral engagements, the need to build coalitions and come up with ideas. There are some in the report. Christina pushed on, suggested others as well. Yeah, public-private dialogues, I think, is certainly very, very important.
Thank you, Claire. Sophia, what's one lessons that Canadians can take away from what's going on in Europe today? Oh, you're muted, Sophia. Sorry.
From my point of view as a journalist, I think, well, dialogue and communication in general, and explaining policy to farmers first because they're the most interested, but also to the wider society and public. And this can be, it is very difficult to do from Brussels because decision making is centralized very far away from the capitals. But I think governments and farming organizations that have representation in Brussels, well, in the case in Canada, they should explain policy making. They should try to not create this polarization of the debate. That's where we're at now. That's why the strategic dialogue was launched, because of the polarization. The protests are also loaded with misinformation or misinformed claims that I'm sure sometimes are not made on purpose, but it's just things are not clear. And of course, governments want to support farming. If they impose sustainability measures, sometimes it's to support a long-term functioning of the farming industry. So I think communication is crucial when creating sustainability policies.
Great. Thank you, Sophia. And Christina, to you finally, what lessons can Canada take away from the EU experience on sustainability, trade, and agriculture policy?
I think it's very much aligned with what Claire and Sophia has been saying. I think it's, to use another term, it's that if you go for something as disruptive as changing your policy driven by sustainability, you need to invest much more in consensus building. So it is not like traditional policy making where you tell, your audience where they need to go. It needs a different approach. It needs more consensus based. That might mean that you can't go as quickly, but I think you get much better at the final target point you want. And the second thing which I would want the Canadians to be aware is, don't see sustainability as another European trade barrier. This is too simple. Sustainability is in the interest of us, everyone. It's a global issue. And in the end, the EU and Canada are much more in the same boat as some might perceive it. And I think you should kind of reflect on that and build on that.
Right. I think that's a really good note to end on, Christina. And again, we look forward to continuing our work on this issue and helping to build that understanding and awareness. And really appreciate Christina, Sophia, Claire joining us today. Thank you to all of our audience members. We will share a link of this on to everyone that's registered. It will be available on our YouTube channel. And please do stay tuned to the CAPI mailing list for upcoming details on what comes next. So thank you very much, all of you, and have a great day.